Okay, again, I've never really done it this way before, but sub, if you're having any difficulties, I think there's like a kind of stop button up here that you can press, and honestly, you should probably press it a lot because if you went as fast as I did, then the notes would take like 10 minutes, but the notes are probably going to take quite a bit more. These are kind of long notes, so all right, here we go. Okay, so today's notes are on federal grants and mandates, and we're going to learn what those are. And then the essential question you're going to answer for your summary is explain which type of grant is more effective, in your opinion, categorical or block. I think either one's an appropriate answer. It just depends on your definition of why or your explanation. Okay, so we start our notes with kind of two different arguments. If you look at your notes, there's the decentralism argument, which is people in favor of states' rights, and there's the centralism argument. So why would you be in favor of decentralism or states' rights? Because the Constitution was an agreement or a compact by the states, which implies strong state authority. The Constitution carefully limits national powers, or rather national authority, to only delegated powers, only those listed in the Constitution. The 10th Amendment gives broad powers to the states, and when in doubt as to which holds the power, matters should be resolved in favor of the states. What that means is if a power is unlisted, then it should favor the states. Now, if the power is listed and it goes head to head with the federal government, we know from the Supremacy Clause that the federal government should reign supreme. Okay, if you believe in a decentralism argument or a states' rights argument, you believe you're a strict constitutionalist. That means you believe that the Constitution should be interpreted exactly as it is, and so not loosely interpreted. Okay, and you believe the national government has gotten too big and too impersonal, too far away. That state governments are closer to the people and thus more authentic, I guess you could say. These are some people, oops, okay. These are some people over time that have favored decentralism from them. I don't know who you need to know. Certainly Reagan favored states' rights, as we talked about the other day with new federalism. And Goldwater, who's somebody that ran in the 60s, and in the modern day. So you notice the theme here is a lot of these guys are Republicans. They favor states' rights. When you see this icon up here, that means there's a video. If you want to play that video, you can. If I was showing this in class, I probably wouldn't show every video, but you could check out a couple and watch a minute of it and see if it's worth your time. So the counter argument to decentralism is a centralist argument. These are people that favor a strong federal government, and they believe the Constitution was created by the people and not by the states. Things that give them power are the Elastic Clause, the Commerce Clause. The Commerce Clause is a part of the Constitution that says that the government can regulate commerce. I think that was on our bell work today, and that has allowed the government to expand their power quite a bit with that clause, because commerce is anything really to do with like trade between the states. Taxing and spending clauses give great power to the national government. Powers go to states only if they've been surrendered by the national government. And when in doubt, these people believe that matters should be resolved in favor of the national government. Okay, so kind of the opposite of what we just read. They're going to favor a loose interpretation of the Constitution, giving them more powers. One thing we've noticed is that the size of our government, it grew quite a bit, but it's been relatively constant for the last 40 years. And while state governments may be closer to the people, these guys would argue that it's the same state governments that have violated people's rights. For instance, the South practicing segregation for the first 70 years of the 19th century, or you can also think of Prop 8 in California that banned gay marriage, where it's always been the national government that's been a key protector of rights over time. Who would follow this idea? Hamilton, Teddy Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, JFK, LBJ, Clinton, Obama, Hillary. Okay, these are people that would follow this idea. The other day in class we learned about McCulloch v. Maryland already, so I'm not going to go into this too much in depth, but this case increased the power of the federal government because they ruled in the federal government's favor. They ruled that the bank was constitutional right thanks to the necessary and proper clause. And John Marshall was the Supreme Court judge, and they agreed that the power to tax is a power to destroy, and states cannot destroy the federal government. So, sorry, national government is supreme, and this is kind of one of the first major cases that has an impact on strengthening the power of the federal government. Okay, so what are some things that give the national government their power? Well, I know this class sounds a lot like we're repeating ourselves, but the elastic clause gives the national government a lot of its power. Remember, the elastic clause is the necessary and proper clause. It's a sentence in the Constitution that has allowed our federal government to regulate all kinds of things. So it gives the federal government power. The fact that we can go to war gives the national government its power. And then I talked about this already earlier, but the Commerce Clause says that the Congress has the right to regulate interstate commerce, and almost anything can count as interstate commerce. So that's like trade between states, but also kind of any trade really that it goes on in the United States. So the result is that Congress can regulate virtually anything. And an example would be like Obamacare. Is healthcare regulated by the government? And they could argue it's regulated because it's interstate commerce. Same topic, sources of national strength, the power to tax and spend for the common defense and the general welfare. So while Congress cannot technically pass laws on anything that they want, they can spend money on virtually everything. And so one way they get the states to do what they want to do is they offer them cash. And if the states accept the cash, they need to accept certain rules. So like one of the ways that we got states to raise the drinking age to 21, it didn't used to always be for 21 years old. One of the ways we got them to raise it was we said, we'll give you cash for the highway, and in exchange we want you to raise the drinking age in your state to 21 years old. So we never passed a law that says you have to be 21 to drink beer. We just told states, if you want money, you need to raise your drinking age to 21. So that's kind of the topic of today's lecture. These are grants and mandates. It's when the federal government is able to get the states to do what they want, and a lot of times it's like by attaching strings to this little stuff. Another big one is, it affects you right now, and the seat that you're sitting in is education money. The federal government gives like maybe 4 out of every $10 for your education, but they demand that you learn Common Core and you do things their way. And if you don't, if the state doesn't teach Common Core, then they're not going to get that $4 out of every $10. So the federal government attaches these strings to get the states to do what they want them to do. And so if there is a law that is in conflict, if there's a state law that's in conflict with the federal law, the courts will step in and squash that state law. Although it can be appealed to the Supreme Court and they can see what happens. And then we're going to learn more about these federal mandates as we go. Okay, so what has been happening recently? We have seen an evolution towards greater federal control of stuff. We've seen the federal government grow in power. I already talked the other day about Nixon's new federalism. Started to return some power back to the states, but you could argue that Obama kind of stopped doing that. You can just fill this in, but it's getting a little outdated now. The Republicans won a victory in the elections of 1994. This is under Clinton. So Clinton returns a lot of rights to the states. And a big one is right here. And I'm not going to talk about it right now in hopes that we are going to talk about it later after I explain what grants are. Okay. If I don't talk about this today, remind me next class, like all these things. All right. There was a case with the Gun-Free School Zones Act in 1995 where Congress they had banned guns in schools. Congress said you were not allowed to have guns near a school. And they used the Commerce Clause to do it, which is a bit of a stretch, don't you think? Like, does that have to do with trade necessarily? The Supreme Court struck that down, saying that the Gun-Free School Zones Act had nothing to do with trade, and thus it could not exist. So they struck it down as unconstitutional. There's some other stuff too, like this Violence Against Women law, Religious Freedom Restoration Act, the Brady Act. All right, this Indiana law. I am not going to like stress and talk about these. They're not important enough, but you can fill in some blanks on your paper if you have some blanks. Okay, so as the national government has grown more powerful, it has used state and local governments to administer programs that it wants. So think of Common Core. Federal government wants to institute Common Core. And as a result, they give money to the states and local governments and to do what the federal government wants. But the problem with this is that the dollar amounts of these have consistently risen. So it's like we're getting a little bit less effective with our spending because we're just giving states a bunch of money to like do this thing that the federal government wants them to do. Okay, so the very most basic thing, the kind of the topic of today is grants and mandates. And so a grant is money from the federal government to the states for a specific purpose. So, boop, boop, boop. Send the dollars. Make it rain, DC. Okay, it's time for you to do a little bit of something on your own. This is a table. The topic of the table is federal grants and aid from 1950 to 1994. Over here you have your years. And I want you to tell me essentially what does this table tell us? So I want you to pause my narration and take like a couple-minute break and talk with your neighbor about what exactly this table is saying. Start your break now. Go to the video and pause. Okay, I've unpaused now. Did you analyze it with your neighbor? Hopefully what you came up with is that in 1950, the federal government was barely giving any grants at all. But over time, the amount of money given to states has increased a ton. In fact, like if you look at as a like this right here is a percentage of money that the state gets. Back in the day, it was 10%. Today, well, that's not even today. It accounts for 24% of money that states get is coming from the federal government. It might even be more today, now that this is like 20 years later. You can go ahead and skip this multiple choice question and, we can look at it together later for the test. Okay, so what is the purpose of a grant? The purpose of a grant is having the states do something instead of the federal government, like give them the money and let them spend the money on their own behalf. And the idea is that this would reduce the size of the federal bureaucracy. So Washington, D.C. is over here in the country, and the idea is if you're sending money over to California, I guess it would go up to Sacramento, it's going to reduce the size of Washington, D.C. and the bureaucracy so that instead of spending that money over here, you can spend it in California, have Californians deal with it. That way California is happier, because we're getting money directly and the size of the federal government is shrinking. So what do these grants do? These grants supply state and local governments with much needed revenue. Revenue means cash. And it establishes minimum federal standards in important areas like Hey California, you want money from us? Well, you better have this standard of air quality, or this standard of water quality, or institute Common Core, or pass Obamacare, or don't let kids drink if they're under 21. So it also equalizes resources among rich and poor states. If everything had to be left up to the states and they had to raise their own money, not to be mean, but like maybe Alaska or something would not have a lot of money to spend and California would have a bunch. So this helps balance things out a little bit between the states. Okay, so we're going to talk about different types of grants now. One of the types of grants is a categorical grant. A categorical grant is one that's given for a specific purpose. So if you gave money to California and you said that it has to be spent on bilingual education, how do you think California feels about that? Would California rather just get money and be told it's for education, or would they rather get money and be told it's for bilingual education? If you guessed they would rather just get money straight up and not have strings attached, then you're right. States do not typically like categorical grants. So states don't like these because they're maybe too specific. Um, States do not have to accept these, but if they do, they have to comply with federal standards. So what it says is the national government agrees to pay a portion of the cost for these, and states have to pick up the balance. So example would be Common Core is an example. I know I've used that a bunch. The federal government will give us like $4 out of $10, and so that means that we need to pick up the remaining $6 if we accept their money. But education is so expensive that it makes sense for us to accept their money. Other examples are Head Start, which is free preschool for poor families, food stamps, Medicaid. So what do you need to know about these types of grants? They serve these categorical grants. I mean, it kind of sounds like that, right? Like category. They serve a specific purpose. There are strings attached to you take this money, then you have to do this thing. So the federal government is kind of like a puppet master for the states. All right, there's another type of grant that falls under categorical grant, which is called a project grant. And I'm not going to stress about this too much. I've never really seen this matter anywhere. But this is when states apply and like compete with each other for grants. And I think like Obama did this with education. He had states compete and like only two would win. But again, I'm not too worried about project grants. Actually, this is it. This is Obama's thing where he had the states compete called Race to the Top. That it made 46 states raise their standards, even though it didn't have any. Okay, another type of grant is a block grant, and this is one that states like. States like these types of grants because they're granted to support a collection of general programs like urban development or transportation, which is like a big open kind of category, which it's not so specific, like just tires or only for a carpool lane on the 15 freeway. Now it's like anything you want to do in transportation. You want to build a train, you want to build a freeway, you want to build roads. So it allows for much more flexibility. Write the word flexibility. All right. So no strings attached. Oh, did anyone actually see this movie? I did not see it. Sorry, Ashton Kutcher. Sorry. I'm kind of going crazy with this little pen thing. It's kind of awesome. Okay, one kind of annoying thing, at least from California's perspective, is like how these programs work with money and the states getting it. So like sometimes it doesn't necessarily match the population as well as it should to be more fair. For instance, um, the Department of Homeland Security gave a bunch of money in grants to Wyoming and California. And if you look at how much money that they got, certainly California got more money. Uh, Wyoming got 17.5 million, California got 164 million. So that's like, oh, we got so much more. But if you compare that per head, like per person, Wyoming got $35 per person. California got $4.7 per person. So that's not really fair when you analyze dollars being spent. This is just a slide showing how much money that is spent on education per state, and it's arranged by the biggest spenders going down to the lowest spenders. Where does California rank per person? California. Man, I'm really looking here. Let's see. There it is. We are like, I don't know, about 66% of the way down the list at $7,000 per kid. So all you guys in the room, that's what you cost per year, $7,000. And this is from 2003, so you probably cost like $8,000 now per year per kid. All right, if you look at the politics of these grants, Democrats generally like to have more strings attached to the money. Like, say if you have a Democrat president, they would probably prefer categorical grants. If you have a Republican president, they would probably prefer block grants because it gives them so much more flexibility. All right, one of the things I told you we would talk about later when we were doing the slide is welfare. Welfare is like money and aid to the poor. And a lot of people in the 90s were complaining about welfare. They thought it was like too much money to people, and there was this idea of the welfare queen, this little, people that were having like 8 kids and collecting more money for each kid that they have. And what do you need to know about welfare? Let's see. You need to know the Welfare Reform Act of 1996. This was with Bill Clinton, and what it did was it made welfare a kind of block grant, and then states could decide kind of how they wanted to spend the money. So this is Clinton doing a kind of Republican thing and allowing the states to have some flexibility for how they spend money on welfare instead of having the federal government dictate how the money is spent. So we look at this slide, it's a table, and the table topic is monthly welfare benefits spent by various states. Check it out for a second. All right, so did you notice that California spends a lot of money on welfare? Texas, South Carolina, not so much. New York, a lot. So this difference in how much is spent is probably thanks to Clinton making welfare a block grant. Okay, this is about President George W. Bush. When you guys were younger, he passed something called the No Child Left Behind Act, and it kind of went against what Republicans normally do, which is like not get involved in state matters, and it set up all these standards for education. And I don't know how important this is anymore because we've replaced it with Common Core, but here it is still on our notes. All right, another important thing to note is federal mandates. Now these are much meaner than a grant. This is the federal government kind of being a bully. So it's a federal order imposed upon the states. An example is, I told you guys the other day, the Americans with Disabilities Act, how they made all the buildings in the country like build the handicap ramps and the people had to pay for it themselves. So the purpose of a mandate is to meet a goal of the federal government. And there's been various mandates in the country like the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act. But the most famous one for the purpose of this class is the Americans with Disabilities Act. Oops, that's totally not the same thing, but I'll circle it up here then. I'll get orange. The most famous one for this class is Americans with Disabilities Act. So states don't like mandates, and number one, they really don't like unfunded mandates. That's when the government tells them they have to do something, and they're not going to give them any money to fix it. So this was the American with Disabilities Act. It was like a ton of money to do these things, but the federal government did not give any cash to assist in the process. So states complained very much about it. And another one is like the Clean Air Act. States had to clean up pollution and they didn't like that. And some states compare a mandate to like blackmail, where it's like if you don't comply, then the federal government's going to keep money, hold money back from other programs. All right, we got another little table here. The topic is the cost of federal mandates for the state of Tennessee. It doesn't take too much analysis to see the cost is going up over time. So the government is requiring states to spend more of their own cash. This is like another way to look at it. I'm gonna guess that's like millions of dollars is what those numbers are. But yeah, so over time the states have had to spend more because the federal government said they had to. Okay, in 1995, you had Bill Clinton, again with the Republican House of Reps. He passed the Unfunded Mandate Reform Act, which said government can't do unfunded mandates. And the result is probably that we've seen our debt like increase a bunch because now states don't have to pay for stuff so much, the federal government does. And that's kind of about it. I'm not going to bother reading all this stuff to you. You can just fill in the blanks. And the next slide is where you're going to write the summary. Explain which type of grant is more effective in your opinion. What do you think is more effective at having a better government for, I don't know, but for both the states and the federal government, a categorical grant or a block grant? I want you to explain in 3 sentences. Okay, cool. Thanks.